Okay, we might look to make a start. I'll say good evening and welcome to our webinar on the Conservation Zones Review for the deferred lands, so the lands that are operating under the Warringah 2000 Local Environmental Plan. My name's Andrew Piggott and I'm the Executive Manager of Strategic and Place Planning at Northern Beaches Council. This session will take you through the work that we've done in relation to our Conservation Zones Review. We're currently on exhibition and this is part of our procedure and process to engage with the community and have a conversation with you about the work and hear from you and get feedback in relation to how that is progressing. I'll start with an acknowledgement of country and say that we acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we're meeting and pay our respects to elders past, present and emerging and any Aboriginal people here with us tonight. In relation to the agenda, we'll take you through the background information, an overview of our Conservation Zones Review. We'll step you through what the draft conservation zones are proposed to be. We'll provide an overview of the technical studies that have informed some of that decision making and then take you through the next steps. The purpose of tonight's meeting is to provide a high-level overview of the project and the work that's been done and give you an understanding of why we've made some of the recommendations we've made and some of the decisions that we've made. It's not necessarily a meeting where we're going to be able to drill down onto individual site-specific issues. And if you do want to talk about particularly site-specific technical issues, we're most certainly happy to talk to you about that in the days following tonight's webinar. We've got staff available via email, on the phone or even in person at our DY office to talk to you about your issues. So as I've said, the purpose is to provide information and an overview of our Conservation Zones Review to look at the big picture, so the Northern Beaches area, and not necessarily focus at the individual site level. Because there's a number of people in the meeting and there's a lot of information to get through, we'll keep people's microphones and cameras off. But by all means, if you have questions and comments, then you're able to type those into the Q&A button that's highlighted there. It should be in the top right corner of your screen. Just type in your questions and we've got some of the team here ready and waiting to be able to provide you with an answer. Just letting you know that the session will be recorded and that will be going up on our website following this meeting. Depending on the nature of the questions, if it's a really detailed technical question, we might not be able to provide you with a detailed answer on the fly during the meeting tonight, but we'll undertake to provide a response following the meeting tonight. Okay. Just looking at our program of work as we work towards the preparation of one Northern Beaches Local Environmental Plan and Development Control Plan. So we started out with an LEP review and health check back in 2018. Then we prepared our local strategic planning statement and that was adopted in March of 2020. We then prepared our local housing strategy that was adopted in April of 2021. We put out an LEP DCP discussion paper back in the middle of 2021 and we're now progressing into our Conservation Zones Review exhibition and Technical Studies exhibition, and then the information from this exhibition will then be fed into a further exhibition of our draft LEP and DCP. So there's another opportunity for people to see the work that we're proposing and comment on that before it is brought in. I'll now hand over to Kim Kirstein, who is consultant who's been working with us in the preparation of this work. And Kim is going to step us through the next part of the webinar. And I'll say, take it away, Kim.
Thank you, Andrew, and good evening, everyone. Before I jump into the approach we undertook for the creation of the draft conservation zones, to start with, we just need to explain what some of the key terms mean to give context to the review. As Andrew mentioned, Council is in the process of preparing a planning framework which involves preparing a new local environmental plan. A local environmental plan, or LEP, is a legal instrument that establishes land use zones and standards to control development. Across the Northern Beaches, there are 4 existing LEPs. This includes the Pittwater LEP 2014, the Warringah LEP 2011, the Warringah LEP 2000, and the Manly LEP 2013. As part of preparing a single planning framework, a new LEP will be prepared for the entire Northern Beaches. Local environmental plans are prepared by the relevant council and approved by the state government. What are zones? Zones and development controls provide a framework for the way land can be used. This framework for the zones is standardised and it's set by the state government. Zones set out what land uses are allowed for or permitted with consent or permitted without consent, and what land uses are prohibited or not allowed. These land uses must relate to the objectives of that particular zone. There are different zones that can be used depending on the intent of the land, including rural zones, industrial zones, commercial zones, recreational zones, waterway zones, and conservation zones. Today, we are discussing the conservation zones. What are conservation zones? Conservation zones, or C zones, are used to protect and manage land that has important environmental value. There are 4 conservation zones identified for land where the primary focus is the conservation and/or management of environmental values or natural processes. The C zones provide for the varying levels of environmental protection and management. The C1 zone comprises existing national parks, nature reserves, and conservation areas established under the National Parks and Wildlife Act. As such, the C1 zone was not considered as part of the C zones review. The C2 zone provides that next highest level of protection and is for protecting, conserving, and rehabilitating land with very high ecological values. So this can include land such as wetlands and littoral rainforests and areas of high value remnant vegetation, generally on public land, and land that has an existing environmental protection mechanism to protect those conservation values, such as a biobanking agreement or a stewardship agreement. The C3 zone is also for protecting, conserving, and rehabilitating land with high ecological values, or land that has environmental processes or natural hazards that require careful management. The C3 zone allows development in limited circumstances, such as low impact development that is compatible with protecting those environmental values or compatible with the risks associated with those natural hazards. The C4 zone is also for protecting and conserving environmental values. However, it accommodates low impact residential development. So it generally is used in low density residential areas to protect land with special ecological values and still allow residential uses to occur on that land, such as dwelling houses. Why are the conservation zones being reviewed? Across Pittwater, Warringah and Manly, there is a variation in how the C zones have been applied in terms of their environmental criteria, their spatial application, and the range of land uses that are permitted. The map on the right shows the differences across the northern beaches. So for example, much of Pittwater is included in a C4 zone, which is the brown coloured area. There is limited application of C zones across Warringah. And Manly, you see the C zones along the foreshore. The C zones review will ensure a consistent approach is applied across the entire northern beaches. It will align with any updated studies and it will deliver on Council's commitment towards greater protection of the environment. What is the purpose of the C zones review? The purpose of the review was to undertake a review and develop a consistent approach for identifying land across the northern beaches with important environmental values and land subject to hazards that should be protected and managed by either a C2, a C3, or a C4 zone. As I previously said, the C1 zone comprises existing national parks, nature reserves, and conservation areas established under the National Parks and Wildlife Act, and as such was not included as part of the C zones review. The approach for undertaking the Conservation Zones review required a robust research process and focus group engagement to understand local issues and experiences and identify the important environmental values and hazards across the northern beaches that need to be protected and managed. In terms of developing the C zones, Phase 1 involved a review of the existing information. This included state expectations and policy requirements, other C zone reviews undertaken by other councils, including the Northern Council's E zone review, which was undertaken by the state government, technical information, such as supporting technical studies and mapping prepared by council, and which is also out on public exhibition currently, community feedback, which included a series of 5 community focus group sessions, which were undertaken in September and October in 2020 to identify what environmental values are considered important for the community across the different places in the northern beaches. Phase 2 then involved identifying the environmental criteria that needed protection and natural hazard processes that need careful management, such as high-risk bushfire and high-risk flooding, as well as the required data to spatially identify the land affected. Phases 3 and 4 involve creating and preparing the proposed draft C zones, which are currently on public exhibition, together with the supporting technical review report for the Conservation Zones review. We are currently in Phase 5 and we're publicly exhibiting the draft C zones review report and its associated mapping outputs. Council is seeking feedback on the criteria and methodology used to create the draft C zones. Following public exhibition, submissions will be reviewed and considered, any site visits will be undertaken as needed, and the recommendations for Council finalised as part of Phases 6 and 7. This slide provides a high-level overview of what was said through the previous 5 focus group sessions with a focus on the deferred lands. Feedback received noted that consultation with the community is required. There is a need for integrity in the process and a justification for the zoning. Site visits are critical. Existing use rights need to be protected and existing uses, land uses maintained under the Warringah LEP 2000. Will Council compensate owners for zoning changes? There was support for protecting the environment, including prioritising protection of wildlife corridors. And it was also noted that areas with high risk bushfire should be included in a C zone. The next part of the briefing, we will go through the draft methodology used for creating the draft C zones. We are seeking comments and submissions on this proposed methodology, which has been used to create the draft conservation zones. This includes the next couple of slides, which will identify and show the criteria used to inform the draft spatial mapping of the C zones. The C zones review has identified a number of environmental values that are worthy of protection through a potential C zone. These criteria have been broken into two values, including high environmental value criteria and medium environmental value criteria. High environmental criteria, which identifies land with high ecological values or the greatest biodiversity and number of species that should be conserved and protected. This includes land with bushland reserves and parks, existing C2 zoned land, biodiversity core habitat areas, which is generally large expanses of relatively intact native vegetation, or land with high to very high conservation significance, threatened ecological communities and threatened species habitat, wetlands and riparian corridors, selected land in a heritage conservation area with high environmental value, and transitional areas between high conservation value land, such as national parks, and low density residential areas in urban areas. Medium value criteria were also identified and are also an important consideration for identifying land with environmental values. However, this land may have been disturbed or modified, or the land requires careful management. For example, biodiversity corridors or the urban tree canopy facilitates flora and fauna movement across the landscape, and they are an important consideration for connecting bushland within your urban settings. Escarpments, major ridgelines, and steeply sloping land, which given their limitation has also meant that they are generally forested and therefore contribute to the urban ecology in suburban residential settings. Planning for natural hazards is fundamentally about risk to life and property, and it's also about taking steps to limit future impositions on other government functions like disaster management, including evacuation, and expenditure on recovery and reconstruction as a result of a natural hazard. Therefore, it is proposed that the C3 zone considers land affected by high-risk natural hazards, where the further intensification of that land would expose people and property to an unacceptable or intolerable risk, and buildings would be vulnerable to failure. It is important to note that utilising a C3 zone on land affected by a high-risk natural hazard is about identifying what land uses are compatible given the nature of the risks on that land. Land uses such as community infrastructure and critical services, vulnerable land uses, and residential and accommodation activities are generally considered sensitive and therefore intolerable in locations where there is a high hazard risk and potentially it's difficult to evacuate people. As part of the C zone, the hazard criteria constraints identified include land subject to coastal and estuarine hazards, land affected by high-risk flooding, land affected by high-risk bushfire, and land affected by steeply sloping coastal cliffs, which are susceptible to instability. The next few slides, we will discuss how the environmental and hazard criteria will apply. It is noted that the deferred lands is considered a non-urban area, and as such, the next few slides focus on how the environmental and hazard criteria are proposed to apply in non-urban areas with a focus on the deferred lands. The C2 zone is proposed to include natural open space and bushland areas, which are primarily managed for conservation purposes outside of national parks and nature reserves. The C2 zone is also proposed for land with an existing C2 zone on it, which has existing environmental protection, where strict controls on development already apply, as well as land that has an existing conservation mechanism requiring its protection for its conservation values, such as a biobanking agreement or conservation covenant. The map on the right shows that most of the proposed C2 zone through the deferred lands includes land that is currently in an RE1 recreation zone. The land has been identified as being managed for conservation purposes, therefore warranting its consideration as a C2 zone. There is also some additional public land within the deferred lands that may move to a C2 zone as part of final mapping creation. This slide is about the application of the C3 zone in non-urban areas. Non-urban areas have extensive tracts of high-value bushland coupled with larger minimum lot sizes, which prevents further lot fragmentation. In non-urban areas, the C3 zone is proposed to apply to land that is identified as having undeveloped bushland, and the site is mapped with one or more of the high environmental criteria. For properties that are less than 5,000 square metres, a C3 zone will be applied where 50% or more of that site is affected. No split zones are proposed to apply. Split zones are proposed to be considered for properties that are larger than 5,000 square metres or more, where 30 to 70% of the property is affected. If 70% or more of that property is affected, the entire site is proposed to be included within a C3 zone. The C3 zone is also proposed to be considered on land where there is a presence of high natural hazard risks, such as bushfire. The map on the right shows that most of the land proposed to be included in a C3 zone in the deferred lands includes properties that are predominantly covered in bushland, and as a result, the property is identified as having high environmental value criteria, including both core habitat and high to very high mapped conservation values. And given the nature of the vegetation coverage, the property may also be affected by high fire line intensity mapping. This slide shows the proposed permitted land uses across the C2, C3 and C4 zones. Dwelling houses are not permitted on land zone C2 under the existing local environmental plans. However, dwelling houses are permitted on land zone C3. This is not proposed to be changed and will be carried over. The C3 zone is proposed to not permit land uses that may not be compatible with natural hazards, including sensitive land uses such as childcare facilities, community facilities, educational establishments, respite daycare centres, group homes, and secondary dwellings. The C4 and residential R2 zone are similar in that they both allow dwelling houses, group homes, and secondary dwellings, as well as low-intensity community activities such as home businesses and childcare facilities and community facilities. The main difference is that the C4 zone is the recognition of environmental attributes requiring a careful consideration during the assessment of a development application, and complying development is permitted in the R2 zone, but not the C4 zone. That means a development application would be required. I'll now briefly touch on the technical studies which have informed the C Zones review and are also out on public exhibition. Council is also seeking feedback and comments on the draft technical studies during this exhibition period. If you are interested in further information on any of the studies which are on exhibition, they are also available on Council's website. The Draft Biodiversity Planning Review is a Northern Beaches-wide technical study which has been prepared to better inform future biodiversity planning controls. The study has included a range of previous biodiversity-related technical studies and mapping relating to the 3 former local government areas, including Warringah and the Deferred lands. Draft mapping has been used to inform the sea zones analysis, and it includes key wildlife habitats or core habitats, which are the larger areas of bushland as identified in green on the map, or wildlife corridors, which are identified in blue. Threatened ecological communities, such as Duffy's Forest Endangered Ecological Community, and threatened species habitat, such as the critically endangered Cayley's grevillea. The draft Deferred Lands Biodiversity Assessment was also undertaken, which comprised of 2 stages and includes 2 reports. The first report includes a detailed review of existing information regarding biodiversity of the deferred lands. The second includes the outcomes of on-the-ground surveys and the mapping of biodiversity conservation significance or values based on threatened species habitat, threatened ecological communities, largely coastal upland swamps and the Duffy's Forest Ecological Community, proximity to protected bushland, for example, the National Park, wildlife corridors or connectivity, and riparian land, including major creek lines. The map colours are intended to represent different levels of conservation significance and include purple, which identifies very high conservation significance, including national park boundaries, major creek lines, and threatened ecological communities. Red, which identifies high conservation significance that is typically large areas of intact remnant vegetation with known threatened species values. Orange, which identifies moderate conservation significance and is typically edge-affected bushland areas on the edge of cleared space. And green, which identifies low conservation significance and is typically cleared and disturbed land. The very high, so the purple, and the high, so the red, conservation land has been used to inform the sea zones mapping analysis. The Watercourse Wetlands and Riparian Land Study summarises a series of technical studies undertaken by environmental consulting firm BNT. It sought to review existing planning controls across the 3 former local government areas associated with watercourse and riparian matters, and it provided recommendations and updated mapping to be incorporated into a unified Northern Beaches local environmental plan and development control plan. Recommendations and mapping identified Category 1 and Category 2 riparian corridors, including a 30-metre buffer zone, and identified wetland areas, including a 100-metre buffer zone. Riparian corridors and wetlands are an important high-value environmental criteria which has spatially identified the location of these environmental features for the sea zones mapping analysis. Meridian Urban was also commissioned to undertake a strategic bushfire assessment for the deferred lands to examine the bushfire risk profile of the deferred lands. The strategic bushfire risk assessment considered fire line intensity, which provides a more refined consideration of bushfire risk from the bushfire-prone lands mapping, which only considers vegetation types. Fire line intensity is a measure of fire intensity at the fire front and is measured as the amount of energy released per meter width of the fire edge. It is a function of fuel characteristics, so vegetation types, structures, arrangements, and quantity, and relationship with fire weather, which influences the potential rate of spread. The bushfire risk assessment provides that the deferred lands area includes a number of areas where high and very high fire line intensities, so over 30,000 kilowatts per meter squared, are likely in a fire event, and higher fire line intensity areas should ideally be considered as part of the application of zoning to avoid land uses that would result in a high risk to life and a risk to property. The Strategic Bushfire Risk Assessment has informed the Conservation Zones mapping analysis by identifying properties that are subject to high fire line intensity where there is a high risk to life and property. The Geotechnical Review Report is a technical study undertaken by engineering consulting firm Douglas Partners. It sought to review the existing planning controls across the 3 former local government areas associated with geotechnical related matters and provided updated mapping and controls to be incorporated in a unified local environmental plan and development control plan for the Northern Beaches. A detailed table and map is contained that tags all land into one of 7 geotechnical planning classes, depending on the known underlying geology, so the known soil, and the topographic position, its slope. The geotechnical review informed identification of properties affected by steep slopes in urban areas. As such, it was not used in the spatial analysis of non-urban areas. The 3 highest risk geotechnical classes informed the spatial mapping analysis of the draft C zones by identifying properties that are at risk from the highest geotechnical classes. Thank you. I will now hand over to Andrew.
Thanks very much, Kim, for that. So just by way of recap, the New South Wales Government requires all councils to review and develop a single planning framework for their local government area. Our proposal, based on comprehensive studies, will help create a sustainable future for the Northern Beaches. We've identified and proposed conservation zones to best fit the attributes of the land, and the proposed change may affect what you can and can't do on your property, but we're still at an early stage in this process and we want to hear your views and your feedback. In terms of the next steps and where to from here, so as we've said, we're currently on exhibition with the formal exhibition period closing on the 30th of October. If you're having troubles getting your submission in by that time, then reach out to us and we can have a chat to you about giving you some extra time if you need that. We'll prepare a community consultation outcomes report that will look at all of the submissions that we've received, and then we will move on to prepare the draft local environmental plan and development control plan that will be reported to council in mid to late 2023. Then there'll be a further round of exhibition and there's further opportunity for comments at that time. Okay, so moving on to some questions that have been asked by people and requested that we answer that tonight, and I'll be able to step through those now. So the first question is, what rural zone will be used in the deferred lands and what will be permitted? So in terms of the rural zones, we are still working through what we're doing with the other zones on the Northern Beaches. Our main focus has been on the conservation zones review for this for this part of the project. And in relation to the rural zones, we're still working through how we're going to apply those across the rest of the Northern Beaches. We'd be interested to hear any feedback people have in relation to their preferences for rural zones. There's 2 rural zones mainly that are used currently. So in the former Pittwater area, the rural landscape zone is used, and in the former Warringah area, the AU4 primary production small lot zone is used. They have different permissibilities, so again, interested to hear what people's views are on that. How is a C3 zone different to a rural zone? So a C3 zone is a conservation zone, and a rural zone is a rural zone. So just looking at their names, you can obviously see that there's differences there. The C3 zone we're proposing to use in areas that are subject to hazards and or high conservation value. So we're saying that those areas particularly, we're not wanting to see, I guess, uses that introduce many more people into those areas that we know are subject to hazard or environments. It's noted you can still build a dwelling house there, but we don't want to see an intensification of development in those areas over and above a dwelling house typology, so that we would be introducing more people and more property and more buildings to exposure to risk and or protecting those areas. Will we still be able to do Airbnb? Yes, you can. So Airbnb is permitted via state policies, and so things like stays and Airbnb is defined as short-term rental accommodation, and that's separately defined by a state policy, and that's allowed. Things like bed and breakfast is separately defined and is prohibited in the C3 zone. It's taken as a form of tourist and visitor accommodation, and that's not permitted in that zone. Why are properties that have been cleared not identified for a conservation zone? So the guidelines provided by the New South Wales Department of Planning prevent us from applying a conservation zone to properties unless they've been identified as either having environmental zones or hazard criteria. Illegal clearing of land is an issue for council, and we'll undertake to prosecute where we have evidence of illegal clearing. How will this affect development applications? So existing development consents will not be invalidated by any change in the zone. Legally approved existing buildings and land uses can remain. Proposed changes to zoning won't come into effect until they are approved by the New South Wales Department of Planning and Environment. Who will be undertaking site inspections? So we've undertaken to do some site inspections where there's issues that remain outstanding. It really depends on what the issue is, what the property is. If it's a bushfire issue, we'll bring out people who are bushfire experts. If it's a biodiversity issue, we'll look to bring out some people who are biodiversity experts. So we need to sort of work out how many site inspections we need to do, where they are, and work out what the timing is going to be and what level of expertise we're going to need as part of that site inspection. Did I miss has the Department of Planning approved the methodology used? Sorry if I missed that one. So we're working really closely with the Department of Planning in the ongoing conversation that we're having with them to prepare our Northern Beaches local environmental plan. They haven't specifically approved the methodology that we're using, but again, we're continuing an ongoing conversation with them. Ultimately, the Department of Planning have to sign off on our LEP. That's part of the New South Wales planning framework, and so that will have to happen around when we report that through council and then onto the department next year. Will landowners be compensated for loss of permissible land uses from rezoning? Look, in relation to that one, when land zoning changed, the range of permissible uses on properties also is likely to change. Compensation or land acquisition is generally not required unless land is rezoned for a public purpose like a park or a road, and equally council doesn't tax any gains made by landowners as a result of rezonings. Is there an opportunity for further community consultation? Yeah, look, as I've said, we've got an 8-week community consultation period that we're running through at the moment. Again, if people are having problems in terms of the timing of the close of the exhibition period, then by all means reach out to us and we can talk to you about giving you an extension if you need it. And then, as I've said, there's another opportunity when we prepare our draft LEP. That also needs to go on an exhibition process, and that's another opportunity for people to comment on that process. How does the recent approval under the Aboriginal Land SEP affect the C Zones review? So the Conservation Zones review is a separate process to the development delivery process that's operating under the Aboriginal Land State Environmental Planning Policy. The Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council must still prepare a planning proposal to rezone any of their land. The Conservation Zones review is not a legislated matter for consideration in the assessment of a planning proposal. However, the underlying studies and data upon which the review is based would need to be considered as part of that process. As a landowner in the Deferred Lands area, the Metropolitan Local Aboriginal Land Council have been notified of the Conservation Zones review. Okay, that's it for the formal questions by the looks of it. I can see there's been some questions and answers in the group chat as we've been going through the process. Looks like there's a lot of responses that are coming in. I can just looking through those now. Conversations. Hopefully there's some answers that have been provided there. See lots of questions and answers. By all means, if you've got questions, type them into the chat function and we'll provide some responses where we can. And see something from John Holman there. Rob Stokes stated that WUFA would be involved with the methodology. Council have shut us out and WUFA have not approved the methodology. Seems odd that council won't give us a specific meeting. Look, I guess just in relation to that comment, that was I think the former Planning Minister Rob Stokes commenting on a previous planning proposal. This is a new process and we're certainly able to engage with you as we go through this process. We are obviously doing a webinar. We have a process where we've provided videos, written letters to all affected community members. The project website has both high-level and detailed information and an interactive online map with proposed zones and maps produced from technical studies, and staff are available via email or phone. So I'm just reading now. We haven't received an invitation to a group meeting. Can you ring me? Yep, we certainly can do that. And we'll make sure that there's opportunity for you to attend a meeting, make that available to you. giving people time if there's any more questions that people wanted to send through. Happy to give people more time to answer any questions. Just give people some more opportunity if people have questions, then we can try and answer them. Again, I think if people are having trouble providing comments by the exhibition deadline, happy to talk to you about giving you some more time to review the material and provide an opportunity to comment. Just reading back through some of the questions and answers here. I think the most recent one, contacted by landowners who don't understand what's proposing. Many landowners don't use computers. You need to engage with them properly, and if they can't use a computer, happy to speak to, if any landowners who contact you, by all means give them our details, John, and we'd be happy to talk to them and step them through what's being proposed. We can talk to them on the phone, or if they want to come in and see us in person, we're available at our DY office here. There's our contact details. So by all means, would encourage you to pass on our contact details to people if they're not able to use computers, then we're available to talk to them face to face and take them through that process. Looks like there was an issue with we're certainly wanting to involve Bushfire representatives. We will provide, but we invited you to the community group meetings. Definitely make sure that there's an opportunity for representatives to attend those meetings and provide all the information that will be available during that process. We can follow that up tomorrow, make sure that that invitation is available, and make sure that has gone out. And if it hasn't, that it does go out. We'll want to make sure that everyone is able to understand what's being proposed and to provide comment within that framework. Give people a bit more time. We've still got, there was 10 more minutes in the meeting. If people have any more questions, by all means, send them through. A question there from Judith. Has any consideration been given to the proposal to establish an internationally recognised geo-region? looks like. Look, I guess in terms of what we're doing here, we're focused on the New South Wales planning framework, and the conservation zones are part of the standard instrument set of zones that we're able to use in a planning sense. So that's the purpose of this conservation zones review. I think the establishment of geo-regions probably sits outside of the scope of what we're doing, and it may be a conversation that we could have with other colleagues in council as to what that looks like and how that would be brought to bear. But it's not something that is within the scope of the work that we're doing as part of this project. Again, concerns from John about the woofer and a meeting. Look, again, we'll check on when that invitation was sent out and make that available to you. Again, look, the consultation framework that was reported to council at the August council meeting set out the engagement approach that the council were wanting us to follow, which we are following, including obviously the website, videos, webinars, letters to affected community owners, making ourselves available, like we've said, and we'll continue to do that through the exhibition period. Again, if people have individual concerns, the challenge with this process is there are very site-specific issues that people want to talk to us about. Every property, really no two properties are the same in terms of their affectations and their the hazards that apply, the conservation affectations that apply, and so it's really lends itself to interrogation via that website tool. And if people still have questions following that, then obviously we're available to talk to you anytime about comments or concerns or questions that you have in relation to those points. So that's the process that we've outlined. Happy to talk to you if you've still got concerns in relation to that. Again, all of the studies are available on the website, so all of that information is freely available. Wanting to make sure that we're as open and transparent as we can be as part of this process and the review, so that we can hear from everyone about their comments and observations in relation to what's being proposed. Give everyone a bit more time if they've got any questions or any comments. We'll try and answer them. The question there, council to write to all landowners that are affected by the proposed zoning changes. We have done that. We sent out over 15,000 letters to landowners that were impacted by the proposed changes. Must outline what permitted land uses they have now. So that information is available on their website, and what you're proposing they get. And they need to be invited to a face-to-face meeting to discuss. So look, we've got a whole heap of information that's available on our website. It sets out what your current zone is, what your proposed zone is, what your current permissible land uses are, and what they're proposed to be. As we talked about earlier, we haven't landed what rural zone is permissibilities necessarily proposed, but interested on people's feedback in relation to that, in the same way that we haven't landed exactly what the residential zones and indeed some of the other zones are as well. The intent of this process was to have a conversation in relation to the conservation zones review. You'd appreciate that sending out 15,000 letters, some people are able to understand that and look at the website and be happy with that. But if people want to have a conversation with us face to face, like I've said, we're available at our DY office here. We're available on the phone and we're available via email. If you have any further questions, happy to talk you through that. What does non-statutory public exhibition mean? So that's a reference to the New South Wales planning system. When you have a formal statutory exhibition, that's like a legal process that you've got to go through before you make legislation. So this is a draft review at the moment, so it's not within the sort of legal framework. And we've intentionally done that because we wanted to make sure we had the opportunity to talk to people without the, that statutory framework hanging over us and the pressure of making a local environmental plan. Last question here, can you commit to what I've asked for above? You've asked for quite a lot of things above, John. We've been trying to answer your questions as they come through. I think we can certainly commit to making ourselves available to talk to you, to inviting Wolfart to the meetings that we've got planned for community groups. Happy to talk to you if you've got any questions in relation to tonight's presentation or proposed changes to where your land holdings are or the broader area. So happy to do that.